Now that we've acquainted ourselves with language and what children acquire um, as they learn to speak, you might ask the question, how does this happen? Where does this come from? Again, we use the Leahy format, the Leahy framework, the Bloom and Leahy framework, really based on Lois Bloom's work, that framework, to understand what child language is comprised of. And we saw that it's comprised of content, form, and use, phonology, morphology, syntax. The content, that's in the area of form. Content, that is ideas about the world. And that in terms of content categories and object knowledge in the area of content. And pragmatics, which comprises functions, the reasons for speaking, and the social skills one has when one speaks. The question that you might have is, how do kids get to learn this stuff? Where does it come from? And it's amazing. It's an amazing situation since, as you see from the work you're doing in collecting your language samples, and those of us who are parents, we see it, that by the time the child is 1.5, they're beginning to talk, and by the time they're 4, they have achieved all of the content form interactions we reviewed when we reviewed the Leahy developmental framework, or the developmental taxonomy based on Lois Bloom's research. Everything that we went through is what children ultimately acquire by the age of 4. So, how do they do it? Well, when I used to teach this course 10 years ago, and way further earlier than that, I approached that question with a major bias. My bias is towards Piaget's explanation of how children develop content of mind. And we will take a look at that, and we will label that constructivism. And another more fancy term for that is equilibration theory. We will look at equilibration and constructivism, in fact, later today. But they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but the fact of the matter is I became, I think, a better teacher at presenting this material by recognizing that although Piaget has makes a very important contribution to language acquisition, and although I favor that approach, it's the question of how children acquire language is a very complicated question that goes beyond any of the work that Piaget did. That is because, let's think about it for a second. What is language? Again, as I just said, as I just reviewed, language is quite complex. It comprises content, form, and use, and all the subcomponents of each: phonology, morphology, syntax, story grammar, discourse rules, content in terms of object relations, event relations, and object knowledge, and pragmatics, and all that goes into that. There's no one explanation, at least in the year 2015, that accounts for the acquisition of all this stuff. It's likely there are multiple processes that are contributing to the acquisition of all of this stuff, all of these components of language. It's complex. Now, there are multiple explanations for language acquisition out there. There is the constructivist position that we will look at, but there's also the operant position, operant theory, and the names associated with operant theory, as I'm sure you're well aware, are Skinner and Ivar Lovaas in the application to autism, and Watson and Thorndike and others. Carbone contemporaneously in another operant approach to language. So operant theory is another explanation for language acquisition. Another explanation I'll call social pragmatic, very associated with Greenspan, Stanley Greenspan's name, but also with Elaine Geller's work and Seema Gerber's work over at Queens College. And that position is just another explanation for language acquisition related to communication between caregiver and child. Another explanation is the one that I'm sure you're most familiar with probably, and that is the Vygotskian position, also reflected by, associated with the names Bruner, Jerome Bruner, Wirch, and many others. And that's the process most associated with this Vygotskian point of view is scaffolding. And I'm sure you have learned in other courses about how caregiver-child interactions, how caregivers scaffold language by modeling and doing a number of things to support a child's language acquisition. We'll look at that here. And also Chomsky's point of view, which really leans on, which is called nativism or minimalism. And that leans on the idea that there's a lot of language that's genetically given and that there's not much learning involved, that the basic process is maturation and experience with one's own language to kind of set parameters in the mind for language comprehension and production. Those are different points of view about language. I used to, again, lean on one point of view, not to the total exclusion of the others, but certainly above and beyond the others, and that is the constructivist position. But again, the way I'm going to be approaching this question in this series of lectures that we'll be doing today and that we'll go over into next week is we're going to look at each point of view about language acquisition and try to recognize that they all say something important. They all explain something about language acquisition. In fact, I would like you to recognize that if anybody asks you how is language acquired, you should recognize that as a trick question, as an unanswerable question. First of all, it's the year 2015 and we are trying to figure that out. But also, again, language has all those multiple components, so you have to ask what part of language are you talking about? What part of language are you asking about? What component of language? Do you mean how is phonology acquired? Do you mean how is the lexicon, that is the vocabulary, acquired? And the morphemes that we use to make sentences, how is that required? How is syntax acquired? Do you mean how is content acquired, content categories? Do you mean specific knowledge about objects? Do you mean pragmatic rules, etc.? Which of these things are you talking about? And that leads us to the position that all of these points of view that I just mentioned and that I'm about to go into, all of these points of view have something to contribute to our understanding of what occurs from birth, really from conception to the time that the child begins to talk and through the language learning period. What occurs to explain language acquisition? There are multiple processes. So our job is to identify them, or what are the many processes that have been proposed by the various researchers out there that have been proposed, and ask the question, how do they fit? Where do they fit? What does each explain? And then we should ask ourselves, as clinicians in a program in speech-language pathology, we should ask ourselves, how can we as clinicians use these different processes, apply them, or do things ourselves so that we can apply or promote these processes in children who are having trouble learning language. Typically, achieving children learn language very easily. It's akin to learning to walk. it's a very easy and natural experience for the child. And we don't have to do anything much extra other than parent the child and allow the child to be exposed to the language of their culture for them to acquire it. But when we work with kids with disability, we really have to think to ourselves, how do we explain the acquisition of the component of language we're focusing on in our clinical assessment or treatment? How do we focus what explains that, and how can we promote that in a child? Or if the child is disabled in that particular area, how can we get around that and use another process to help the child learn? These processes, I think, are redundant. That is, if one thing is broken, there are other ways often to get at language learning. But first, let's look at how language is acquired. That's what we're going to look at, how language is acquired. And we are going to look at constructivism, the operant position on this, the social pragmatic position, Greenspan's position, the Vygotskian scaffolding position, the Skinnerian position, the nativist position. Minimally, those are the things we're going to really focus on. And I am going to begin with constructivism because I do favor that particular position, and there are a number of reasons why I think the constructivist position is critical, extremely important to our understanding of language acquisition. At least one component of it, one primary component, and that is content of mind.